welcome to Games as Lit 101. In my analysis of Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time, I mentioned that video games can enhance their storytelling through interactivity without necessarily allowing the player to change the events of the story. Let's expand on that a bit. To do this, I'm going to identify two distinct types of narrative interaction. Now, of course, the concept's a little more complicated than this, and there are plenty of in-between areas between these two distinctions, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to stick to the two extremes. We can talk about the subtleties in later episodes. These two types of narrative interaction we'll refer to as major narrative interactivity and minor narrative interactivity. For the purposes of this video, I'm just going to refer to them as major and minor interactivity, because major narrative interactivity is a bit of a mouthful to be saying regularly, but what is important to remember throughout this video is just that we are talking specifically about the context of interactive narrative. Terms like major and minor interactivity would probably mean something a bit different in the context of general game design or interactive media publication, so just, keep it in context. Major interactivity is the most easily noticed, so it's probably the kind that we're most familiar with. When you're deciding whether you should save or destroy a city, or whether to kill a man to save your own son, or whether you should take sides with the Imperials or the Stormcloaks, this is the type of narrative interactivity you're experiencing. This is what most people think of when they imagine an interactive story experience. Games like the ones I just referenced have been praised for their ability to allow the player to have a direct involvement in the events of the story. The choices you make in these games lead the story in different directions. Sometimes you can end up with different relationships between you and some of the other characters in the game. Sometimes you can change the meaning of the story to an extent, or even its genre. Infamous 2 is an example of a game that tells a victorious story if you're good, but becomes a tragedy if you take the evil route. The themes of the story remain the same, but one ending communicates them through tragedy, while the other does so through noble heroism, and your choices and actions determine which. We'll talk more about this in a later episode, but for now, it's still worth noting that these types of video games actually have a specific kind of introspective value. They're going to present you with a situation and require you to make a decision. Any linear art form can, of course, inspire you to think more deeply about certain political, ethical, philosophical dilemmas, what have you, but a video game like this is going to actually present you with one of those dilemmas and force you to decide where you stand, make a decision, and live with the consequences of the decision you made, whether good or bad. That's pretty powerful. But this isn't the only way to incorporate meaningful interactivity into a story, which is good, considering how expensive and time-consuming it tends to be for the developer. The alternative is something we're going to refer to as minor narrative interactivity. This is when you're not actually altering the events of the story in any way, but you're still interacting with it in a way that adds or emphasizes meaning in the story. This is the kind of thing I was talking about in the Prince of Persia analysis. The game used its mechanics to emphasize the growing dependency between the prince and Farah, and developed their characters mostly through and during the gameplay, thus utilizing interactivity in its storytelling even though the player couldn't alter the narrative. But this takes many other forms as well. At its simplest, minor interactivity happens in every game you've ever played. The simple ability to step into the shoes of a character invokes it. It creates something of a subconscious bond with the player character, and makes it easy to identify with them. This is the reason we talk about the events of a game in the first person, rather than talking about the character. It increases the drama and excitement of a game to let you say, I'm the one doing this. I'm responsible for this. How could I have done this? The feeling of actually being the one to accomplish these things inherently allows for huge emotional ups and downs. The Last of Us utilizes this in a powerful way at the start of the game. Minor spoilers here, but only for the first few minutes. It uses a cutscene to set up Joel's relationship with his daughter, Sarah, but then puts the player in control of Sarah when everything starts going wrong. By putting the player in the shoes of a young girl, it makes them feel more vulnerable than if they started off in control of Joel. It's not major interactivity, but it's still a key difference. It keeps the player there for a while, allowing them to look at the scenery and events as Sarah while the stage is being set, before transferring control to Joel when it's time to protect Sarah, which unfortunately ends tragically. None of this can be changed by the player's actions. This sequence is going to play out in basically the same way, regardless of what you try and do. But the game directs your interaction in these scenes for the purpose of making them more powerful, and in doing so, it sets an interactive tone for the game as a whole that is going to clash very purposefully and very beautifully with the events near the end of the game. Which I'm not going to spoil here. Go play The Last of Us. Other games utilize minor interactivity to put the player in a situation where they have some control, but can't actually overcome what they're going to face. The classic example of this is the boss that you're not intended to beat, which was used very effectively at the beginning of Demon's Souls to set the tone, but it's also often used for the purpose of emphasizing a feeling of helplessness, or perhaps driving home how little freedom the player truly has. Games like, well, The Last of Us, Spec Ops: The Line, and BioShock, among others, all utilize minor interactivity for the purpose of making you feel like you have more control over the protagonist and over the events of the story than you actually do. And yes, all three of those are getting literary analysis episodes at some point. Unfortunately, many people just completely ignore minor interactivity. It's been a growing belief among gamers that if a video game isn't utilizing its ability to let the player change the story, then it's not playing to its strengths as an interactive medium. But that's not true at all. Many of gaming's greatest narrative moments have been based on the use of interactivity to emphasize something unchangeable, rather than allowing change. Neither major nor minor interactivity are more important than the other, it's just a matter of what a game's trying to achieve. After all, the more control of the story is handed over to the player, the less control the designer actually has over it. Telltale's The Walking Dead can mean all sorts of things depending on the player's choices, which is part of what makes it great, but that's also why someone who wants to make a specific point with the story might choose to make a more linear experience, without that much major interactivity. It all depends on what the creator wants to accomplish with the game. The important thing to understand here is that interactivity is a lot more than just the ability to change a game's story. Major interactivity is of course a very important part of this medium, but so is minor interactivity. The point is that one way or another, we're designing our video game experiences in such a way that allows the player to interact meaningfully with the story, which can be accomplished in a variety of ways. And we will be seeing a lot of different ways that that can be done on this show as it progresses. Do you have any favorite instances of minor narrative interactivity? Or do you think that major narrative interactivity is capable of setting up the better scenarios? Whatever your input, go ahead and talk about it in the comments. Just try not to be too spoilerific. I mean, if you're talking about some of gaming's greatest moments, you'd hardly want to ruin that for anyone else. Next week, we'll be taking a look at Bastion, one of the most thematically unified video games I have ever played. I do recommend you play the game before watching that episode, and if you want to be aware of what games we'll be talking about in the future so you can come prepared, go ahead and check out our episode schedule on our website. Link is in the description. So, until next week, class dismissed.